Out on the high plains, loneliness isn't just a feeling. It's a physical thing, a weight that presses down on you from the empty sky, a chill that blows in with the constant wind. For Arthur McBride, that weight was heavier than most. The year was 1885, and his world had shrunk to the size of a dusty cabin, a few stubborn cows, and three small children. Ever since he'd buried his wife, Martha, grief had moved in and made itself at home. It never helped with the chores, never paid any rent. It just sat there in the corner watching. His life was a brutal rhythm of work, sun up to sundown, mending fences, pulling weeds, fighting a land that didn't want him there. He was a father, a rancher, a survivor, and he was worn down to the bone. His little ranch was squeezed between a wall of rock and the edge of Navajo territory, a place people told him to avoid. But the land was cheap, and with three kids to feed, cheap was the only word that mattered. There was Clara, his oldest, only 12, but she had the serious eyes of an old woman. She was a living echo of her mother, quiet and capable. Then came Henry, 8 years old, a ball of pure energy and endless questions, always into something. And finally, little Rose, 5 years old. Her laughter was the only thing of value left in his life, the only currency that still meant something. They were his whole world, his reason to keep going, and the anchor that kept him from just drifting away. But every day was a battle, a fight against the seasons, against broken tools, against the gnawing fear of not having enough. He was a hollowed-out man, running on fumes. Then one afternoon, under a sun so hot it made the air shimmer, he rode out to check his northern fence line. It was a desolate stretch of rock and cedar that bled into the Navajo lands. He had his rifle with him, more out of habit than anything else. The silence out there was total, just the creak of his leather saddle and the buzz of a fly, until he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a hawk. It was a choked, guttural sound, the sound of pure pain. It came again, weaker this time. Arthur pulled his horse to a stop. Every nerve in his body was on fire. He slid off the saddle, tethered his horse, and moved forward on foot. The sound led him to a narrow, shaded canyon, a deep cut in the earth. And that's when he saw her. Lying on the ground, half hidden by sagebrush, was a young Navajo woman. Her black hair was spilled across the dust, her face twisted in agony. One of her legs was trapped, caught in the rusted metal jaws of an old bear trap. The teeth had sunk deep into her calf, a gruesome mess of blood and bone. The dirt beneath her was stained dark red. Arthur froze. His mind raced. A white man finding an injured Navajo woman, right here on the border of their lands? This was a lit match next to a barrel of gunpowder. The smart thing to do was to turn around, to ride away and pretend he'd seen nothing. He had children to protect. He couldn't risk it. But then he looked at her eyes. They were dark and fierce, filled with a defiant fire. She wasn't pleading for help. She was trying to pull her own leg free, her hands slick with blood, gasping with the effort. He couldn't leave her. The part of him that was still a decent man, the part of him that was a father, just wouldn't let him. He holstered his rifle, a clear sign he meant no harm, and held up his hands. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice raspy. "I can help." She watched him, her body coiled like a snake, ready to strike. He saw the fine silver and turquoise jewelry she wore, the detailed beadwork on her moccasins. She carried herself with an air of nobility, even now trapped and bleeding in the dirt. He moved closer, slow and careful, like he was approaching a spooked horse. "The trap," he said, pointing. "I have to open it." He knelt a few feet away, studying the old rusted mechanism. It was going to take every bit of his strength. "This is going to hurt," he warned, mostly to himself. He reached for the release springs. She flinched, a hiss of pain and warning coming from her lips. He met her gaze again. "Let me help," he repeated, his voice soft. For a second, he saw something change in her eyes. Not trust, but a desperate understanding that she had no other choice. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. He put his knee on the base of the trap, grabbed the cold, rusted steel, and pulled. His muscles screamed. The veins in his neck stood out. Sweat poured into his eyes. The trap groaned, but it wouldn't budge. The woman let out a sharp cry as the movement sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg. "Hold on," he gritted out, and pulled with everything he had. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. He thought it was rusted shut for good. Then with a loud, sickening crack, the jaws popped open. Just an inch. Just enough. "Now!" he grunted, and with his free hand, he carefully pulled her mangled leg free. The moment she was loose, she collapsed, her breath coming in ragged sobs. He knew she couldn't walk. Leaving her here was still a death sentence. Infection, predators, the brutal sun. They'd finished the job. There was only one thing to do, a choice that would lead trouble right back to his front door. He tore a strip from his own shirt and wrapped the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. As he did, her head lolled to the side. She was unconscious. He carried her to his horse. The journey back to the cabin felt like 100 miles. He managed to get her onto the saddle in front of him, her head resting against his chest, her breathing shallow. He felt like a man who had just picked up a lightning bolt, with no idea when or where it was going to strike. When he rode into his yard, the children stopped playing. Their mouths fell open. Clara's face went tight with worry. Henry's eyes were wide with fear. Little Rose hid behind her sister. "Clara, get the door," Arthur commanded. "Henry, fetch clean cloths and a bucket of water. Now." He carried the woman inside and laid her on his own cot. The small cabin suddenly felt crowded, charged with a dangerous new energy. He worked fast, cutting away the blood-soaked deer skin to get a better look at the wound. It was worse than he'd thought. Much worse. Clara stood beside him, her face pale but her hands steady, a silent helper. Together they cleaned the gash. Arthur knew from doctoring animals that a wound from rusted metal meant blood poisoning was a real threat. He found his small bottle of carbolic acid, diluted it, and cleaned the injury as best he could. The woman moaned, but she didn't wake. He bandaged the leg tightly. For the rest of the evening, an uneasy silence filled the cabin. The woman, he didn't even know her name, drifted in and out of a feverish sleep. Arthur sat in a chair beside her, his rifle now propped against the wall. He knew what he had done. He had brought the wild, unknown world right into his home. He had invited danger to sit by his fire. He could already hear the whispers from the folks in town. Got himself mixed up with an Indian. The children were spooked. They ate their supper without a word, their eyes darting from their father to the stranger on the cot. Later that night, the woman's fever spiked. He bathed her forehead with cool water, trying to keep her comfortable. In the flickering lamplight, he studied her face. It was strong, with high cheekbones and a proud jaw. Even unconscious, she had an unbreakable spirit about her. He wondered about her family, her life, her world that was so close to his, yet 1,000,000 miles away. He must have dozed off because he woke with a jolt to the first gray light of dawn. She was awake. Her dark eyes were open, the fever gone, and they were fixed right on him. She pushed herself up, wincing. "Desba," she said, her voice a low, musical rasp. She touched her chest. "Arthur," he replied, touching his. It was a start. He brought her water, and as she drank, the tension in the room seemed to ease just a little. But the peace was shattered a moment later. It was Henry. He'd gone outside and came sprinting back in, his face white as a sheet. "Papa," he hissed, his voice trembling. "Papa, come quick." Arthur grabbed his rifle and moved to the door. He peered out, and his blood ran cold. The horizon, empty just moments before, was now dark with riders. Dozens of them. Navajo warriors on horseback, sitting perfectly still, their shapes like black cutouts against the rising sun. They were armed. Their faces were painted. They were a silent, terrifying army. At their head was an older man with a face like carved granite and a headdress of eagle feathers. A chief. This was it. The lightning was about to strike. He glanced back at Despa. She had pulled herself up, a look of alarm on her face. "Children, back room, now," Arthur said, his voice low. "Don't make a sound." Clara, her eyes wide with terror, herded her siblings away. Arthur took a deep breath. He couldn't show fear. He leaned his rifle just inside the doorframe, where he could grab it, and stepped out onto the porch. He stood there alone, facing them down. The riders just watched him. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, pressing down on him. The silence was deafening. Finally, the chief urged his horse forward, stopping just outside Arthur's rickety fence. His dark, piercing eyes scanned everything: the cabin, the chickens, the patched-up roof. Then his eyes settled on Arthur. It was a look that felt like it could peel back your skin and see right into your soul. Arthur met his gaze and held it. He would not look away first. Minutes felt like hours. He thought of his children huddled inside. He thought of his promise to his dying wife to keep them safe. And he knew this was all his fault. One single act of kindness had brought an army to his door. He braced himself for the violence he was sure was coming. But then the cabin door creaked open. Despa stood there, leaning on a makeshift crutch. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear. She looked at the chief, and a flood of Navajo words poured from her lips. Her voice was strong, carrying across the silent yard. She spoke for a long time, gesturing, to the canyon where he'd found her, to her bandaged leg, and then to Arthur. The chief, her father, Arthur now realized, listened without moving a muscle. His stern expression never changed, but his eyes kept shifting from his daughter to Arthur. When Despa finished, the chief, whose name was Hostin, spoke for the first time. His voice was like distant thunder. One of the warriors beside him began to translate, his English broken and sharp. "She is Despa, my daughter," the translator said, his eyes hard as stone. "She says you freed her from the iron tooth. She says you brought her to your home. You cleaned her wound." Arthur just nodded, his throat too dry for words. Houston spoke again. "Our trackers followed the trail," the translator continued. "We found the trap. We found your boot prints next to her blood. We came expecting to find her body and to take payment from you. And your children?" A wave of ice-cold dread washed over Arthur. He had been right. They had come to kill him. But then Hostin's gaze fell on the neatly wrapped bandage on Despa's leg. He looked at Arthur's poor, struggling ranch. He saw the poverty, the hardship, and he saw the man who, with every reason to be afraid, had chosen to show mercy. Hostin spoke a final time, his voice softer. The translator looked shocked. He hesitated. "Our law demands a life debt be honored," the translator said slowly. "You have saved the daughter of a chief. This creates a debt. My chief does not wish to be in debt to a white man." Arthur braced himself, expecting an offer of horses or blankets. "He sees you are a man alone," the translator went on. "He sees your herd is thin, your fields are dry. The winter will be hard for you." The translator paused, taking a deep breath. "My chief, Hostin, makes you this offer. My people will give you 20 head of cattle and 10 sacks of corn. We will see that no harm comes to you or your family from our lands, and the debt will be paid." Arthur's mind spun. It was a fortune. It was survival. It was a miracle. I accept," he managed to say. "Thank you." The translator held up a hand. "That is the first part of the offer." Arthur's heart sank. Of course, there was a catch. "My daughter's leg is badly hurt. She cannot ride a horse for 2 days back to our camp. To move her now would be dangerous," the translator explained. "She must heal where she is safe." His gaze was intense. "The offer stands only if you allow Despa to remain here, in your home, under your care, until she is strong enough to travel. You will shelter her, as you have already done. In return, you will have our protection, our provision. The debt will be honored through this shared duty." It was an offer that would change everything. It meant defying the prejudices of his own people. It meant this proud, beautiful woman would remain in the center of his life. He looked from the stone-faced chief to the doorway, where Despa stood watching him, her eyes holding a question he couldn't yet read. He thought of the long, silent evenings, the crushing weight of his loneliness, and for the first time in 2 years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It was possibility. Arthur McBride looked at the Navajo chief and gave a single, firm nod. "She can stay," he said, his voice clear and steady. "She will be safe here." A look of profound relief washed over Despa's face. Chief Hostin watched Arthur for a long moment, and then, for the first time, he inclined his head in a gesture of respect. He gave a sharp command, and the wall of warriors turned and flowed back toward the horizon, melting away as quickly as they had appeared. But Arthur's relief was short-lived, because as he helped Despa back inside, he noticed something. Something that made his blood run cold all over again. On the ground near where the chief's horse had stood was a single spent rifle cartridge. It was brass, shiny and new. Not the kind of old lead bullet a Navajo warrior might use. It was the same modern center-fire cartridge that his own rifle used. The kind you could only buy in town. And it hadn't been there before Hostin arrived, which meant one of those warriors had a rifle just like his. A modern rifle. That didn't make any sense. He picked it up, hiding it in his palm. A cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The next few weeks fell into a strange new rhythm. True to his word, Hostin's men delivered a small herd of healthy cattle, their horns gleaming in the sun. They brought sacks of corn and beans, filling his empty pantry. The threat of winter starvation was gone, but the real change was inside the cabin. Desba's presence filled the silence that had haunted the place for 2 long years. As her leg healed, she moved from the cot to a chair by the fire, her hands always busy. She taught Clara how to weave beautiful patterns with dried grasses. She taught Henry the Navajo names for the birds. She had a special way with little Rose, telling her stories of Coyote, the trickster, and the star dancers, painting a world of magic over their dusty, drab lives. Arthur found himself watching her constantly, the way the firelight caught the silver bracelets on her wrist, the way she smiled at his children, a rare, beautiful smile that transformed her proud face. They still struggled to talk, using a patchwork of single words and gestures, but they were starting to understand each other on a deeper level. He'd come in from the fields exhausted and filthy, and she'd have a hot meal waiting for him, not just his usual bland beans, but something new, seasoned with wild herbs she'd sent Henry out to find. She mended his family's clothes with stitches so fine they were almost invisible. She was bringing a quiet beauty and order back into a house that had been nothing but a shelter for grief. He tried to ignore the brass cartridge he'd hidden away in a small wooden box. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, but it nagged at him. One afternoon, his neighbor, Silas Croft, rode over. Silas was a big man with a ranch that bordered Arthur's on the other side. He had a folksy smile that never quite reached his cold, watchful eyes. "Heard you had some visitors," Silas said, leaning on his saddle horn and looking over Arthur's new cattle with a greedy glint in his eye. "Quite a commotion, they say in town." "Just a misunderstanding," Arthur said, his hand instinctively going to the pocket where he imagined the cartridge was. "It's all sorted out now." "Is that so?" Silas grinned. "Well, you want to be careful, McBride. Getting tangled up with that crowd, it never ends well. Bad for business. Bad for your health." It was a friendly warning, but it felt like a threat. "Anyway," Silas said, changing the subject, "I came to repeat my offer. I still want to buy this place off you. Name your price. It's a generous offer, enough to get you and the kids set up somewhere civilized." "The land's not for sale, Silas," Arthur said firmly. "Not now, not ever." Silas's smile tightened. "A man can change his mind. This land has a way of breaking people. Remember your Martha." A cold fury rose in Arthur's chest. "You leave my wife's name out of your mouth." Silas just chuckled, a low, nasty sound. He tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Arthur shaking with a mixture of anger and fear. That night, as Desba and Arthur sat by the fire after the children were asleep, she noticed the tension in his face. "That man," she said, her English getting better every day. "Silas. He is not a good man." "You know him?" Arthur asked, surprised. She nodded slowly. "He comes to our land sometimes, tries to trade. My father does not trust him. He has a shadow in his heart." Arthur thought for a moment, then made a decision. He got up, retrieved the small wooden box, and brought it back to the fire. He opened it and showed her the shiny brass cartridge. "I found this after your father left," he said. "One of the warriors dropped it." Despa's eyes widened. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the maker's mark on the bottom. A look of dawning horror crossed her face. "This is not from one of my father's men," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They do not have these guns. Only one man I have seen with a rifle like this." "Who?" Arthur pressed, his heart pounding. She looked up at him, her dark eyes filled with a new and terrible understanding. Silas, she said. The pieces clicked into place with a sickening thud. The trap, the modern rifle, Silas's repeated aggressive offers to buy his land, his veiled threats. The trap I found you in, Arthur said, his voice barely a whisper. It wasn't an old one, was it? It was new, rusted from being left out in the rain for a few weeks maybe. But it wasn't old. Despa shook her head. It was strong. The steel was new. Arthur felt a wave of nausea. He kept his own traps in the barn. He went there now, his lantern cutting through the darkness. He counted them. One was missing. His own trap. The one Silas must have stolen. He stumbled back to the cabin, his mind reeling. He set the trap, Arthur said, the words tasting like poison. Silas set my trap on the border of my land. He was hoping to catch, what? A coyote? Or was he hoping to start a war? Despa looked at him, her face grim. If a warrior from my tribe had been found dead in a white man's trap, my father would have burned this whole valley to the ground, starting with your cabin. It was a setup. Silas wasn't just trying to scare him off his land. He was trying to get him killed. He was trying to start a conflict that would wipe Arthur and his family off the map, leaving the land free for him to take. The man had smiled at him, offered him a handshake, all while plotting to have him and his children slaughtered. But there was a piece missing, a huge gaping hole in the puzzle. Why? Why was Silas so obsessed with this specific piece of land? It was rocky, dry, and barely able to support a family. It wasn't worth killing for, unless there was something here Arthur didn't know about. He looked at Despa, whose face was a mask of concentration. He was not just trading when he came to our lands, she said slowly, thinking back. He was always asking questions about the old stories, the old places. She paused, her eyes locking onto his. He asked about the Silver Canyon, she whispered. A legend, my people call it. A secret place where the rock is lined with veins of pure silver. A place my ancestors swore to protect. Its location is known only to the chief. A secret passed down from father to child. He thinks it's here, Arthur breathed, on my land. That had to be it. Silas wasn't after his ranch. He was after a silver mine, a mine that could make him richer than a king, and he was willing to do anything, to kill anyone who stood in his way. He thought of Silas's chilling words. This land has a way of breaking people. Remember your Martha. Martha. She had loved to walk the property, to explore the canyons and ridges. She knew this land better than he did. A terrible memory surfaced. A few weeks before she got sick, she'd been excited. She told him she'd found something. A special cave, she'd called it, hidden behind a waterfall in a narrow canyon. She said it shimmered. He'd been too busy, too tired to go with her. He'd told her they'd go see it on Sunday. But that Sunday never came. She took to her bed with a fever she never recovered from. A fever. Or was it? Despa, he said, his voice shaking. My wife. She didn't just die of a fever. It was quick. The doctor said it was like a poison, but we couldn't figure out how. He looked at the woman who had become the center of his world, his eyes pleading for an answer he was terrified to hear. There are plants, she said softly, roots, berries, things that grow in the high desert. If you know what you're doing, you can make a poison that looks like a sickness. It is a slow, cruel magic our people forbid. Silas. Silas, who knew the land, who knew about herbs and plants. Silas, who wanted this land so badly he was willing to murder for it. The truth hit Arthur with the force of a physical blow. His wife hadn't died. She had been murdered, and the man who did it had been smiling to his face for 2 years. The grief Arthur had carried for so long curdled into something else, something hot and sharp and righteous. Rage. He wasn't a victim anymore. He was a hunter, and he was going to hunt the man who had destroyed his family. He won't get away with this, Arthur vowed, his voice a low growl. I'll see him in the ground. Despa placed a hand on his arm. Her touch was firm, steadying. Not alone, Arthur McBride, she said, her eyes burning with a fierce light of their own. "He has wronged my people too. This is our fight now." For the first time, Arthur realized the debt wasn't what he thought it was. Hostin hadn't left his daughter here as payment. He had left her here as a guard, as a partner. He must have suspected something was wrong in this valley. He must have trusted that together, Arthur and Despa could uncover it. The cattle and corn weren't a gift. They were supplies for the coming war. Arthur and Despa spent the next few days planning, talking in low whispers after the children were asleep. The cabin no longer felt like a home. It felt like a command post. They had to prove it. It wasn't enough to know Silas was a murderer and a thief. They needed proof that would stand up, proof for the law, and proof for Hostin. "The cave," Arthur said, the memory of Martha's last excited words haunting him. "The one my wife found. It has to be the place. The Silver Canyon." "If it is, the entrance will be hidden," Desba said. "Our legends say it is protected by spirits. You can only find it if you know what to look for." "Martha found it," Arthur insisted. "She said it was behind a waterfall." "There are dozens of small waterfalls on this land after a rain," Desba countered. "We could search for weeks." They needed a guide, a map, and then Despa remembered something else. "My grandmother," she said, her eyes distant. "She was the keeper of the stories. She wore a necklace, a flat stone, carved with symbols. She said it was a key." "A key to what?" "I don't know. She died when I was young. The necklace was buried with her." A dead end. Arthur's hope sank, but then Despa's eyes snapped back into focus. "No, not buried. My father gave it to me after I came of age, to honor her memory." She looked down at her own neck, which was bare. "I always wore it. I was wearing it the day of the trap." Her hand flew to her leg, remembering the searing pain. "It must have broken off when I fell." The key to the silver mine, the proof they needed, was lying out there in the dirt, somewhere between the border and the canyon where he'd found her. It was a needle in a haystack, a huge, dangerous haystack crawling with snakes and lorded over by the man who wanted them both dead. "We have to find it," Arthur said. "It's the only way." The next morning they set out at dawn. Arthur left a nervous Clara in charge, with strict instructions to lock the door and not open it for anyone but him. He carried his rifle, and Despa, now walking with only a slight limp, carried a long, sharp hunting knife. They rode to the canyon where it all began. The rusted bear trap was still there, a grim monument to Silas's evil. "I was running," Despa said, her voice low. "I had seen him on your land. He was digging, searching. He saw me and he chased me. I ran this way, toward the rocks." They began to trace her path backwards, their eyes scanning every inch of the ground. It was slow, painstaking work. The sun beat down on them, and the silence of the plains felt heavy, menacing. Every shadow looked like Silas lying in wait. Hours passed. Hope began to fade. "It's no use," Arthur said, wiping sweat from his brow. "It could be anywhere." "No," Desba insisted, her gaze unwavering. "It is here. I can feel it." She closed her eyes, her face calm. She seemed to be listening to something Arthur couldn't hear. The wind, the earth, a memory. Then her eyes opened. She walked purposefully to a cluster of sagebrush, the very one he'd first seen her hiding behind. She knelt down and began to run her fingers through the dust and dry leaves. Her fingers stopped. She pulled something from the dirt. It was a flat, gray stone, about the size of her palm, hanging from a broken leather thong. It was covered in intricate carvings. The key. But as Desba held it up, a shadow fell over them. "I'll be taking that." Arthur spun around, raising his rifle. Silas Croft was standing there, not 20 feet away. He had his own rifle, and it was aimed directly at Despa's heart. He wasn't alone. Two other men, rough-looking types Arthur had seen in town, stood behind him, pistols drawn. "I knew you'd come back for it," Silas said with a smug grin. "Save me the trouble of having to find it myself. Now be a good girl and toss it over." Despa's hand tightened around the stone. She didn't move. "And you, McBride," Silas sneered, his eyes full of hate. "I should have known you were too stubborn to die easy, just like your wife." The confirmation, spoken so casually, sent a bolt of pure fire through Arthur's veins. "You son of a bitch," Arthur growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Silas chided, nodding toward Desba. "You shoot me, my boys shoot her, then they shoot you, and then your little brats back at the cabin are all alone. I don't think you want that. Do you?" It was a standoff, a three-way dance of death under the blistering sun. Arthur's mind raced. He was outgunned. Any sudden move would get them both killed. He had to play along. For now. "Give it to him, Desba," Arthur said, his voice strained. She looked at him, her eyes questioning. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Not yet." She hesitated, then tossed the stone necklace onto the ground between them. "Good girl," Silas said. One of his men moved forward to pick it up. "Now what, Silas?" Arthur demanded. "You've got the map. You going to kill us now?" "Oh, I'm tempted," Silas chuckled. "But no, a map is useless if you can't read it. You see, these squiggles and lines don't mean much to a man like me, but they mean everything to her." He jerked his rifle toward Despa. "She is going to take me to the silver, and you, McBride, you're going to be our insurance policy. You're all coming with me." They were prisoners. Marched at gunpoint, they were forced deeper into the canyons of Arthur's own land. Silas held the stone map, forcing Desba to interpret the symbols. "It says, to follow the water that flows uphill," she said, her voice tight with defiance. She was lying, trying to buy time, leading them on a wild goose chase. But Silas wasn't a fool. "Don't play games with me," he snarled, pressing the rifle barrel into her back. "I've spent years studying their legends. I know enough. I know it's near a waterfall. Now where is it?" They were trapped. If she refused, he'd kill Arthur. If she led him to the mine, he'd kill them all anyway. Arthur looked around desperately. The canyon walls were steep. There was no escape. He thought of his children, alone and unprotected. A cold dread, worse than anything he'd ever felt, washed over him. He had failed them. As they rounded a sharp bend, they came upon a small box canyon. A thin trickle of water ran down a rock face, creating a small waterfall that fed a pool below. "This is it," Silas breathed, his eyes wide with greed. He shoved Despa forward. "The stories say the entrance is hidden behind the water. Go on, find it." Despa walked slowly toward the waterfall. She looked back at Arthur, her eyes filled with a silent, desperate message. He knew what she was thinking. This was their last chance. It was now or never. He caught the eye of one of Silas's hired guns, a twitchy man with shifty eyes. Arthur locked his gaze on him, ignoring Silas completely. He was trying to get inside the man's head, to unnerve him. As Desba reached the waterfall, she slipped her hand into a fold in her deerskin dress. Arthur knew she still had her knife. "There's no cave here, Silas," Arthur said loudly, trying to create a distraction. "You've been chasing ghosts. There is no silver." "Shut up, McBride," Silas yelled, his attention diverted for just a fraction of a second. It was all the time Despa needed. She didn't go behind the waterfall. Instead, with a powerful cry, she plunged her hand into the pool of water at its base and pulled out a thick, heavy rock, slick with moss. She spun and hurled it, not at Silas, but at the twitchy gunman Arthur had been staring at. The rock caught the man square in the face with a sickening crunch. He went down without a sound, and all hell broke loose. Arthur reacted instantly, diving for cover behind a boulder as Silas's rifle roared, the bullet sparking off the rock where his head had just been. The second gunman fired his pistol, the shot going wild. Despa, knife in hand, charged not at Silas, but at the second gunman, a furious blur of motion. She was a warrior, fierce and deadly. The man, startled by her ferocity, stumbled backward. Arthur knew this was his only chance. While Silas was distracted by Despa's attack, Arthur raised his own rifle from behind the boulder and took careful aim. He didn't aim for Silas's chest. He aimed for his shoulder. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against him. The shot echoed through the canyon like a clap of thunder. Silas screamed, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain, and his rifle clattered to the ground as his arm went limp. At the same time, Despa disarmed the second gunman, the man's pistol flying into the brush. He turned to run, but Despa was faster. tackling him to the ground. It was over in seconds. Arthur emerged from behind the rock, his rifle trained on Silas, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief and agony. "It's over, Silas," Arthur said, his voice deadly calm. He walked over and picked up the carved stone map. He then retrieved Silas's rifle. He had won. But as he looked at the man writhing on the ground, the man who had murdered his wife and terrorized his family, he felt no triumph, just a cold, empty weariness. The rage was gone, burned out, leaving nothing but ash. He wasn't a killer. He was a father, a husband. He looked at Despa, who had the second gunman securely tied with his own belt. She was breathing heavily, her eyes blazing. She had saved them. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now," Arthur said, looking at the two captured men and the one unconscious on the ground. "We bring them to justice, your father's and mine." Getting the three men back to the ranch was a grueling task. They tied them up securely and forced the two conscious ones to help carry their unconscious partner. When they arrived back at the cabin, the relief on Clara's face was so profound it almost brought Arthur to his knees. His children were safe. That was all that mattered. He locked Silas and his men in the sturdy root cellar. "I need to get a message to your father," Arthur told Despa. "He will come," she said. "He sends scouts to watch the ridges. They will have seen the strangers. They will have heard the shots. They already know something is wrong." She was right. Less than an hour later, a lone Navajo rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It was one of Hostin's best warriors. Despa spoke to him in their native tongue, her words fast and urgent. She told him everything: the trap, the map, the murder of Martha, the gunfight. The warrior's face, already stern, hardened into granite. He gave a sharp nod and rode off as quickly as he had come. "He goes to bring my father," Despa said, "and the marshal from the town." Now all they could do was wait. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Arthur sat on his porch, his rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. Despa sat with him. The children were finally asleep inside, exhausted by the fear and turmoil of the day. The quiet that settled between them was different now. It wasn't the silence of strangers, but the shared silence of soldiers after a battle. "Your wife," Despa said softly. "Today, we fought for her." Arthur nodded, his throat tight. "Thank you," he whispered. The words felt small, inadequate for what she had done, for what she had come to mean to him. "You saved me first, Arthur McBride," she replied, her lips curving into a small smile. "The debt is paid." He knew then that the debt had never been about cattle or corn. It was about honor, about justice, about two people from different worlds finding common ground in their fight against a shared evil. Just as darkness fell, two groups of riders appeared from opposite directions. From the east came Chief Hostin at the head of 20 warriors, their faces grim and determined. From the west came the town marshal, a weary-looking man named Griggs, with a posse of 5 deputies. The two groups met in Arthur's yard, a tense mix of leather, steel, and suspicion. Arthur and Despa stood up to meet them. What followed was a story told in 3 voices. Arthur told his part, his voice clear and steady, laying out Silas's greed and deception. Despa told hers, presenting the carved stone map and describing the chase. And then they brought a bleeding, defeated Silas Croft out of the cellar. Faced with Hostin's cold fury and the marshal's unwavering gaze, Silas broke. He confessed to everything. He admitted to stealing Arthur's trap to start a range war. He admitted to killing Martha, describing the poison he'd used, a confession that made Arthur's hands clench into fists. He admitted to his obsession with the silver, his voice dripping with the pathetic whining of a man who had lost everything. Marshal Griggs listened, his face grim, and slapped the irons on Silas and his men. "I reckon you've had this coming a long time, Silas," Griggs said, hauling him away. "Murder, attempted murder, inciting a conflict, you'll hang for this." As the marshal's posse disappeared with their prisoners, a profound silence fell over the yard. Chief Hostin stepped forward. He looked at Arthur, his dark eyes holding a deep, unreadable expression. He then looked at his daughter, who stood proudly beside Arthur. He saw the way they looked at each other. He spoke, his voice deep and resonant. This time there was no need for a translator. He spoke slow, careful English, for Arthur's ears alone. "You are a good man, Arthur McBride," the chief said. "You have honored my daughter. You have avenged your wife. You have brought peace to this valley." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, the healthy cattle, and the children peeking out the window. "The debt between us is paid," Hostin declared, "but a new thing has grown in its place. An alliance. A friendship." He then turned to Despa. He spoke to her in their language, his voice soft. She replied, her voice firm and clear. She never took her eyes off Arthur. Hostin turned back to Arthur, a rare, slow smile spreading across his weathered face. "My daughter tells me her spirit wishes to stay in this place," he said. "She says her home is no longer with my people. She says her home is here, with you." Arthur's heart, which he thought had been broken beyond repair, suddenly felt whole again. He looked at Despa, this incredible, fierce, beautiful woman who had crashed into his life and saved him from a prison of grief and loneliness. He saw his future in her eyes, a future that wasn't empty and silent, but filled with her strength, her warmth, and her love. He reached out and took her hand, her fingers curled around his, warm and strong. It felt like coming home. "Yes," Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at Hostin. "She is already home." The land was still hard and life would still be a struggle. But for the first time in a very long time, Arthur McBride wasn't facing it alone. He had found more than justice for his past. He had found a promise for his future. It's amazing how one small act of kindness can change the entire world, isn't it? Arthur McBride had a choice that day. He could have ridden away, and no one would have blamed him. But he chose to help, and in doing so he didn't just save a life. He uncovered a terrible secret and found a love he never thought he'd have again. It just goes to show you that even in the darkest of times, the right choice can lead you into the light. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of unbelievable twists and hidden justice, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. And don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss a new story. Thanks for watching.